A pot of stew, frozen in time, holds a mother's final gift to her daughter. But when grief becomes too heavy to bear, a loving cousin and a skilled chef embark on a journey to transform this memory into something more. What happens when food becomes a bridge between the past and the future? This is a story about love, loss, and the healing power of connection. The kitchen was warm, filled with the earthy aroma of herbs and slow-cooked meat. Amber stood by the stove, her hands moving with practiced ease as she stirred the stew. The pot bubbled softly, releasing scents that had been a part of Alice's childhood for as long as she could remember. It was more than just food. It was a tradition, a language of love spoken without words. Alice sat at the small wooden table, watching her mother move around the kitchen. She loved these evenings, when the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them and the comforting rhythm of their shared rituals. Amber glanced over her shoulder and smiled. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice light but tinged with curiosity. "I'm just thinking," Alice replied, though she didn't elaborate. How could she explain that she'd been feeling a strange ache lately, a sense of time slipping through her fingers? Her mother had always been her anchor, the one constant in a world that often felt uncertain. But lately, Alice had begun to notice the fine lines around Amber's eyes, the way her movements were sometimes slower than they used to be. It frightened her, though she tried not to let it show. "Well, stop thinking so much," Amber said with a teasing grin. "Dinner's almost ready." She ladled the stew into 2 bowls, the rich sauce glistening in the soft light. Steam curled upward, carrying with it the scent of thyme and rosemary. Amber placed a bowl in front of Alice and sat down across from her. For a moment, they ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against ceramic and the occasional sigh of contentment. "This is perfect, Mom," Alice said finally, breaking the quiet. Her voice was thick with emotion, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the stew, or it was the weight of everything she couldn't say aloud. Amber reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I'm glad you like it." Later, after the dishes were cleared and the kitchen tidied, Amber began to feel unwell. At first it was subtle, a slight pallor to her face, a faint tremor in her hands. But within minutes, she was clutching her chest, her breathing shallow and labored. Alice froze, her heart pounding as she watched her mother collapse into a chair. "Call an ambulance," Amber whispered, her voice barely audible. The hours that followed were a blur of flashing lights and hurried voices. Alice sat in the cold sterility of the hospital waiting room, her mind racing with fear and disbelief. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression told her everything before he even spoke. Amber was gone. In the days that followed, Alice moved through her grief like a ghost. She couldn't bring herself to return to the kitchen, couldn't face the emptiness where her mother's presence used to be. And then, one evening, she opened the freezer and saw it, the container of stew, untouched since that night. Her chest tightened as she stared at it. The stew was more than just leftovers. It was the last thing her mother had made for her, the final act of love before everything changed. Alice closed the freezer door, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away, but she couldn't bring herself to eat it either. So it stayed, frozen in time, a relic of a past she wasn't ready to let go of. That night, Alice stood in the dim light of the kitchen, staring at the freezer. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the appliance. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold back the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the truth. Her mother was gone, and the stew was all she had left. 5 long years had passed since that fateful night, and Alice had learned to live with her sorrow in silence. Life outside continued as usual. She went to work, greeted neighbors, and tended to her plants. But inside the house, time seemed to have stood still. The container of stew remained untouched in the freezer, a relic of a past that Alice couldn't bring herself to face. For 5 years, the stew stayed there, frozen not just in temperature but also in time and memory. It was then that her cousin Juliet, concerned about Alice's prolonged state of grief, decided it was time to intervene and find a solution to help her dear cousin find peace. Juliet arrived at Alice's house on a crisp autumn afternoon, her hands full with grocery bags and a determined look in her eyes. She hadn't seen her cousin in weeks, and the silence between them had grown heavier with each passing day. Juliet knew Alice was grieving, but she also knew that grief could swallow a person whole if left unchecked. She wasn't about to let that happen. The house was quiet when Juliet stepped inside, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. She called out Alice's name, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. When there was no response, she sighed and headed toward the kitchen. It was always the heart of Amber's home, the place where laughter and warmth had once filled every corner. Now it felt like a shadow of what it used to be. Juliet set the groceries on the counter and began unpacking them, her movements deliberate. She wasn't just here to clean or cook. She was here to remind Alice that she wasn't alone. As she worked, her eyes landed on the freezer. It stood there, unassuming yet heavy with meaning. Juliet hesitated for a moment before opening it. There it was, the container of stew still sitting untouched. Juliet stared at it, her chest tightening. She remembered the night Amber had made it, the way they'd all laughed and talked around the table. It had been one of those evenings that felt eternal, as though nothing could ever change. But everything had changed, and now the stew was frozen in time, just like Alice seemed to be. Juliet closed the freezer door gently, her mind racing. She couldn't fix what had happened, but she could help Alice find a way forward. The stew was more than just food. It was a memory, a connection to Amber. And if Alice couldn't bring herself to let go of it, then perhaps the stew needed to be transformed instead of abandoned. The idea came to her suddenly, fully formed. She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Charles was a renowned chef, known not just for his skill but for his ability to breathe new life into old recipes. Juliet had met him once at a family gathering, and though they weren't close, she knew he was the right person for this. When Charles answered the call, his tone was polite but guarded. "Juliet, what's going on?" "I need your help," she said without preamble. "It's personal." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm listening." Juliet explained everything. The stew, Amber, Alice's grief. She could hear the hesitation in Charles's voice when she finished, but she pressed on. "This isn't just about food. It's about helping someone heal. You're the only person I know who can do this." Charles was silent for a long moment. "You're asking me to take something deeply personal and try to, what? Fix it?" "No," Juliet said firmly. "Not fix it. Revitalize it. Honor it. That stew is a piece of Alice's mother, and right now, it's trapped in limbo. If anyone can help her reconnect with it, it's you." Charles sighed, but there was a softness in his voice when he finally spoke. "All right, I'll do it." Relief washed over Juliet, followed by a flicker of hope. She thanked him quickly, then hung up and leaned against the counter, staring at the freezer once more. She didn't know if this would work, but she had to try. For Alice, for Amber, for the love that still lingered in every corner of this house. That evening, Juliet returned to her own apartment, her mind buzzing with plans. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that sometimes healing required taking risks. As she prepared dinner for herself, she thought about the stories of resilience Amber used to tell, of finding light in the darkest moments. Juliet smiled faintly, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The next morning, she delivered the frozen stew to Charles's restaurant, careful to explain its significance. He listened intently, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "I'll treat this with the respect it deserves," he said. "But Juliet, you should prepare yourself. This might not work." "It has to," Juliet replied, her voice steady. "Because if it doesn't, I don't know what will." As she walked away, leaving the stew in Charles's capable hands, Juliet felt a strange mix of fear and determination. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. Alice deserved a chance to move forward, even if it meant starting with a single bite of stew. Charles stood in the quiet sanctuary of his kitchen, the frozen container of stew resting on the counter before him. The early morning light filtered through the windows, casting soft shadows across the stainless steel surfaces. He stared at the unassuming plastic tub, its label faded but still legible. Amber's stew. It was more than an ingredient list or a dish. It was a fragment of someone's life, a thread connecting past and present. He hesitated, his hands hovering over the container. This wasn't like any other project he'd taken on. There were no accolades to chase, no critics to impress. This was about something far more delicate: memory, love, loss. He exhaled slowly, reminding himself why he had agreed to this. Juliet's words echoed in his mind. Honor it, revitalize it. He didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but he knew he couldn't approach this like any other recipe. Carefully, Charles began the process of thawing the stew. He worked with precision, placing the container in a bowl of cold water to gently bring it back to life. As the ice melted, the faint aroma of thyme and rosemary began to fill the air. It was subtle at first, almost ghostly, but it grew stronger as the stew warmed. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, letting the scent transport him. He could almost picture Amber standing over a stove, her hands moving with care and purpose. Juliet visited the restaurant later that day, bringing with her stories of Amber. She sat at the edge of the kitchen counter, her voice steady but tinged with emotion as she spoke. Amber wasn't just Alice's mom, she said. She was everyone's mom in a way. She had this way of making people feel like they belonged. Her house was always open, her table always full. Charles listened intently, jotting down notes not just about ingredients but about the woman behind them. Juliet described how Amber would hum while she cooked, how she'd adjust seasonings with a pinch of this or a dash of that, trusting her instincts completely. She never followed recipes exactly, Juliet added with a small laugh. She said cooking was about feeling, not rules. As the days passed, Charles immersed himself in the task. He tasted the stew cautiously, analyzing its flavors with the expertise of a chef but also with the sensitivity of someone who understood its significance. The base was rich and hearty, built on a foundation of slow-cooked meat and vegetables. But there were subtleties too, a hint of sweetness from carrots, a whisper of earthiness from mushrooms. Each bite told a story, and Charles felt the weight of preserving it. He experimented carefully, adding only what was necessary to enhance the stew without overshadowing its essence. A touch of fresh thyme here, a splash of red wine there. He worked slowly, deliberately, ensuring every adjustment honored Amber's original creation. The process became meditative, a way of paying tribute to a woman he'd never met but whose presence lingered in every spoonful. One evening, as Charles stirred the pot, Juliet appeared again. She watched him silently for a moment before speaking. "You're doing more than just cooking, you know?" He glanced up, surprised by the intensity in her voice. "What do you mean? This isn't just about food anymore," Juliet said. "It's about giving Alice a chance to reconnect with her mom, to find closure. You're helping her heal." Charles looked down at the stew, his chest tightening. He hadn't thought of it that way, but now he understood. This wasn't just a culinary challenge. It was an act of compassion. He nodded, his resolve deepening. "I'll make sure it's perfect." When the stew was finally ready, Charles ladled a portion into a bowl and set it before Juliet. Steam rose in gentle curls, carrying with it the familiar sense of Amber's kitchen. Juliet stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she reached for the spoon. The first taste brought tears to her eyes. It was Amber's stew, unmistakably so, but it was also something more. Charles had preserved its soul while breathing new life into it. Juliet set the spoon down and covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Charles watched her, his own emotions rising. He hadn't expected this reaction, hadn't anticipated how deeply the stew would resonate. But seeing Juliet's response made everything clear. This wasn't just about flavor or technique. It was about connection, about bridging the gap between past and present. When Juliet finally looked up, her eyes were red but shining. "Thank you," she whispered. This is exactly what Alice needs. Charles nodded, though his throat felt tight. He didn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he focused on packaging the stew carefully, wrapping it in layers of insulation to ensure it stayed warm during the journey to Alice's house. As he worked, he felt a strange sense of fulfillment, not the kind that came from praise or recognition, but the kind that came from knowing he'd done something meaningful. That night, as Charles locked up the restaurant and walked home, he thought about Amber and Alice, Juliet and the stew. He realized that cooking wasn't just about feeding people. It was about nourishing their hearts, their memories, their souls, and he felt truly grateful for the work he did. Juliet arrived at Alice's house with the stew carefully tucked into a thermal bag. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch, and Juliet hesitated for a moment before knocking. She wasn't sure how Alice would react, but she knew this was a step that couldn't wait any longer. Alice opened the door, her expression guarded. "Hey," she said softly, stepping aside to let Juliet in. The house felt heavy, as though the air itself carried the weight of years of unspoken grief. Juliet forced a smile and held up the bag. "I brought something for you." Alice frowned, her gaze flickering toward the kitchen. "What is it?" "You'll see," Juliet replied, her tone gentle but firm. She walked past Alice and set the bag on the counter, pulling out the container of stew. The aroma began to fill the room almost immediately, rich and familiar, like a whisper from the past. Alice froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes widened as she stared at the stew, recognition dawning across her face. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I took it to someone who could help," Juliet explained. "Someone who understands food and memory better than anyone I know." Alice shook her head, taking a step back. "You had no right," she said sharply, her voice cracking. "That stew. It's all I have left of her." "I know," Juliet said, her own voice breaking. "And that's why I did it. You've been holding on to it for so long, Alice. But holding on isn't the same as remembering. This isn't about letting go. It's about finding a way to keep her with you." Alice looked away, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to argue, to push Juliet away, but the scent of the stew was overwhelming. It wrapped around her like an embrace, pulling her back to moments she thought she'd lost forever. Her mother's laughter, the warmth of the kitchen, the sound of the spoon scraping against the pot. Juliet placed a bowl of stew in front of her, the steam rising in soft curls. "Just try it," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "For her." Alice stared at the bowl, her hands shaking. She reached for the spoon hesitantly, as though afraid it might vanish if she touched it. When she finally took a bite, the world seemed to stop. The flavors exploded on her tongue, vivid and alive. It was her mother's stew, exactly as she remembered it, the perfect balance of savory and sweet, the comforting richness of the broth. But it was more than that. It was new, somehow revitalized without losing its essence. Each bite carried memories, yes, but also a reminder that love didn't disappear just because someone did. Tears spilled down Alice's cheeks as she continued eating, unable to stop. Juliet sat beside her, her own eyes filled with tears. Neither of them spoke. Words felt unnecessary. The stew was doing what they couldn't, bridging the gap between past and present, between loss and healing. Finally, Alice set the spoon down and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Juliet reached out and pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as she cried. They stayed like that for a long time, the weight of their shared grief finally giving way to something softer, lighter. She had spent the last few years still in mourning, with the memory of her mother present in her daily life, and this moment was a tribute, an honor that she could barely measure in words. When Alice finally looked up, her eyes were red but clear. "I've been so scared to let her go," she admitted, her voice raw. "But holding on to that stew, it wasn't helping me keep her. It was keeping me stuck." Juliet nodded, brushing a strand of hair from Alice's face. "She's still with you, Alice. Not in the stew, but in everything she taught you. in the love you carry. Alice glanced at the bowl, now half empty, and smiled faintly. This, this feels like her, like she's saying it's okay to move forward. From the doorway, Charles watched silently, his presence unnoticed. He had accompanied Juliet to ensure the stew was delivered properly, but now he felt like an intruder on something deeply private. Still, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Seeing Alice's reaction, the way the stew had brought her both pain and peace, was a powerful reminder of why he had agreed to help in the first place. As Alice and Juliet sat together, sharing quiet tears and fragile smiles, Charles slipped away, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't need to stay any longer. His part was done and the rest belonged to them. That night, as Alice cleaned the bowl and placed it gently in the sink, she felt a shift within herself. The stew had been a tether to her mother, but now it was something else, a bridge, and she felt ready to cross it. The kitchen was alive with warmth and movement. Alice stood at the stove, stirring a large pot of stew with steady hands. The aroma filled the air, rich and comforting, just as it had always been. But this time, she wasn't cooking out of obligation or habit. She was cooking to honor her mother, to celebrate her life rather than mourn her loss. It had taken weeks to gather the courage to open her mother's recipe box, tucked away in a drawer she rarely used. The handwritten notes were smudged in places, the paper softened by years of use. Alice smiled as she read through them, hearing her mother's voice in every scribbled instruction. Add more time if you're feeling bold. One note read, "Trust your instincts," another urged. Amber's spirit seemed to hover in the room, guiding her hands. Juliet arrived early, carrying flowers and a bottle of wine. She set them on the counter and hugged Alice tightly. "Smells amazing in here," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "You're really doing this." "I am," Alice replied, her voice steady but warm. "It feels right." Charles came next, his presence quieter but no less meaningful. He brought a loaf of freshly baked bread, its crust golden and crackling. "I thought it might pair well," he said with a small smile. Alice thanked him, touched by the gesture. Though they hadn't spoken much since that night, his role in her journey was undeniable. As guests began to arrive, the house transformed into a space of laughter and connection. Alice moved between the kitchen and the dining room, serving bowls of stew and sharing stories about her mother. She spoke of Amber's generosity, her knack for making everyone feel welcome, her belief that food could heal even the deepest wounds. "This stew isn't just hers," Alice said, addressing the group as they gathered around the table. "It's ours. It's a piece of her that lives on in all of us." Her voice wavered slightly, but her smile remained strong. "Tonight, we're not just eating dinner. We're celebrating her life and finding a way to carry her memory forward." The meal unfolded in a tapestry of shared memories and quiet reflections. Charles watched from the corner of the room, sipping his wine as he listened to the stories. Juliet sat beside Alice, her hand resting lightly on her cousin's arm. The stew became more than food. It became a symbol, connecting those who loved Amber and reminding them of the joy she had brought into their lives. After dessert, a simple apple pie Alice had baked herself, the group lingered, reluctant to let the evening end. Someone suggested playing music, and soon the living room was filled with soft melodies. Alice found herself dancing with Juliet, their movements clumsy but full of laughter. Their house felt alive again, brimming with the kind of warmth that only love and community could create. When the last guest finally left, Alice stood in the doorway, waving goodbye until their car disappeared down the street. The house was quiet once more, but it didn't feel empty. Instead, it felt peaceful, as though Amber's presence lingered in every corner. Alice returned to the kitchen and began cleaning up, humming softly to herself. As she washed the dishes, her gaze fell on the recipe box sitting on the counter. She picked it up, running her fingers over the worn edges. Then, with a deep breath, she placed it back in the drawer, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. The recipes were a part of her now, just as her mother's love was. Later that night, Alice sat by the window, staring out at the stars. The grief she had carried for so long hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It no longer weighed her down. Instead, it reminded her of how deeply she had loved and how deeply she still did. She thought about the stew, about the journey it had taken her on. It had started as a relic of the past, frozen in time, but it had become something new, a symbol of healing, of connection, of hope. And as she sat there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of the moment, Alice realized she was ready to move forward, not forgetting her mother, but carrying her forward in everything she did. The next morning, Alice woke early and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky painted in hues of pink and gold. She took a deep breath, feeling the promise of a new day. Inside, the kitchen waited, ready for whatever she decided to create next. How do we carry the people we've lost without letting their absence define us? Alice's journey reminds us that love never truly fades. It evolves, finding new ways to live within us. So, what memories do you hold dear? And how can they guide you toward healing? Let this story inspire you to honor the past while embracing the beauty of moving forward. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Embrace the Journey for more emotional tales.